What if events went differently in Captain America's Civil War? Imagine if the Incredible Hulk was in Civil War. How do you think the timeline would change as a whole? And how would the MCU be shaped if Bruce Banner decided to choose a different path in Avengers Age of Ultron? Welcome back, my fellow watchers of the multiverse, to another brand new Marvel's What If video, and in today's video we are finally going over this request. I had a previous request almost 3 years ago where it was discussed upon what if Thor and what if the Hulk were both in Civil War, but this time I wanted to center this story about the Incredible Hulk and dive into this big fan fiction movie. And as a bonus, I wrote what would have happened if, the Hulk wasn't in Thor Ragnarok. So that is also a big part of this storyline. So that being said, if you guys are new to the channel, do make sure to subscribe, like, share, and turn those notifications on so you and your friends are all up to date whenever I post a video. But that being said, my fellow watchers, let's dive into the brand new episode. On the brink of war. Not the kind fought with soldiers and flags, but one of ideologies. A fracture between those who once stood together as heroes. The Sokovia Accords had drawn a deep line through the Avengers, forcing them to choose between freedom and control. Friendships shattered, loyalties splintered. But while Captain America and Iron Man prepared for battle, one man, the one man who could tip the scales in either direction, remained hidden, watching the world tear itself apart from the shadows. Bruce Banner had been running for years, but this time, he had found a place where no one could reach him. Wakanda, a nation veiled in secrecy and untouched by the outside world, had become his sanctuary. He was no longer a scientist, no longer an Avenger, no longer the thing he feared most. Here, deep within the golden plains and dense forests, he was just a man. But peace was fleeting, and even in a place as hidden as Wakanda, shadows of the past had a way of finding him. At night, Bruce would stare at the reflection of the stars on the surface of a quiet stream, seeing himself in its rippling distortion, fractured, unstable. The guilt clawed at him every day. Sokovia, Ultron, the Hulk's rampage in Johannesburg. He had done that. He had helped build the machine that nearly ended the world. He had let himself become a weapon. Maybe Tony had moved on, convinced himself they had done the right thing, but Bruce couldn't. The world wanted to register superpowered individuals, to put heroes in cages, and deep down, he understood why. If he had been on the other side, he would have feared himself too. News from the outside world still found its way to him. The moment he heard about the Sokovia Accords, he knew the inevitable would happen. Steve and Tony would never see eye to eye on this. But was it his fight? Could he even allow himself to get involved? A part of him wanted to disappear forever, to let the world forget the name Bruce Banner. But another part of him, the one that still carried the burden of past mistakes, wondered if running was just another form of cowardice. But before he could decide, the war found him first. Thousands of miles away, U.S. Secretary of State Thaddeus Ross studied a classified intelligence report with a clenched jaw and an old bitterness simmering in his veins. Bruce Banner confirmed sighting Wakanda. The words on the page set his mind ablaze. The Hulk, one of the most destructive forces on the planet, was being harbored in a nation known for keeping its secrets. Wakanda had claimed neutrality in the Accords, but this changed everything. Ross was never a man to let things go. His hunt for Banner had been fruitless for years, and now, with the world's attention fixed on the battle between Rogers and Stark, he saw an opportunity. If he could secure Banner, he wouldn't just be capturing a fugitive. He'd be proving to the world that unchecked superhumans needed control. But Wakanda was not a nation that allowed outside interference. This mission had to be done quietly. Ross's orders were swift and absolute. Send in a covert strike team. Extract Banner before anyone realizes he's gone. If the mission failed, termination was authorized. The night the soldiers came, Wakanda was at peace. A warm wind swept over the trees, carrying the distant sounds of the capital's vibrant life. Deep in the wilderness, Bruce sat by the stream, the glow of the moon casting silver streaks through the dense jungle. His thoughts had been darker than usual. How much longer could he hide? How much longer until he was forced to pick a side? Then, the first explosion hit. The ground trembled beneath him, the shockwave sending ripples through the water at his feet. His pulse spiked. Then came another, this time closer. Fire erupted in the trees. The once quiet jungle now alive with the crackle of flames and the sharp bursts of gunfire. Bruce's heart pounded in his chest. They had found him. Figures moved through the smoke. Dark silhouettes in combat gear, their rifles raised, suppressors hissing as they fired. The first shot hit him in the ribs. Not a bullet, but a high-impact stun round. Bruce staggered back, gasping, pain radiating through his chest. More shots followed, slamming into his body, trying to bring him down before he could transform. His instincts screamed at him to run, to hide, but his body was already reacting. His hands trembled, his breathing became uneven, his pulse quickened into a violent rhythm. Not now. Not here. If he let the Hulk out, Wakanda would suffer for it. A soldier rushed him, swinging a shock baton in a sharp arc. Bruce barely dodged, stumbling over a thick root as the baton crackled with energy. The soldiers were coordinated, tactical. They knew exactly how to subdue him without triggering a transformation. But before they could overwhelm him, the jungle itself came alive with vengeance. Wakandan warriors descended from the trees like shadows given form, their vibranium spears piercing through the darkness. The first soldier fell before he could react, a spear striking true, sending him collapsing into the dirt. The others turned their weapons toward the new threat, but they were outmatched. The Wakandans moved like lightning, their armor reflecting the firelit chaos. A single warrior disarmed 3 men before they could even react, their bodies crumbling under precision strikes. And then, the Black Panther arrived. T'Challa moved with effortless grace, claws slashing through the last of Ross's men in a blur of motion. Within seconds, the strike team was either incapacitated or dead. The jungle was silent again, save for the crackling of distant flames. Bruce, still gasping from the stun rounds, met T'Challa's golden gaze. There was no warmth in his expression, only judgment. "You brought war to my country," the king said, his voice like tempered steel. Bruce swallowed hard. "I didn't know they were coming." T'Challa looked at the fallen soldiers, his expression unreadable. A long silence stretched between them before he finally spoke again. "Then you must leave before more follow." Bruce didn't argue. He knew the truth. This wasn't over. Ross would never stop hunting him. If he stayed in Wakanda, he would only bring more war to a nation that had already lost its king. By morning, Bruce Banner was gone. Days later, the news spread across the world like wildfire. The Sokovia Accords had fractured the Avengers. Steve Rogers and his allies had gone rogue. Tony Stark was leading the charge against them. And in the midst of it all, Bruce Banner's name surfaced once again. Not as a hero, but as a fugitive. Ross had failed to capture him in Wakanda. That was an embarrassment. But now he would make sure Banner had nowhere left to hide. The order was given. Find him, capture him, or kill him. Bruce had been running for years, but this time there was nowhere left to run. Because this time his path was about to collide with the war that would change everything. The world was unraveling. The Sokovia Accords had splintered the Avengers beyond repair. And now, on the tarmac of a German airport, that fracture was about to explode into full-scale war. The lines had been drawn. Steve Rogers and his allies, standing against government control, faced off against Tony Stark and the sanctioned Avengers, each side believing themselves to be the last defense against chaos. The battle would decide more than just the fate of the Avengers. It would determine the future of every superpowered individual across the planet. But as fists clenched and weapons were drawn, neither side realized that another player had just entered the war. Buried deep within an armored transport on the outskirts of the airport, Bruce Banner sat in silence, a prisoner once again. His wrists and ankles were bound in restraints that pulsed with an unsettling hum, sending subtle vibrations through his nervous system. Stark designed suppressors, meant to keep his transformation in check. The room around him was cold, reinforced with the latest anti-metahuman technology. Its walls lined with pulsar inhibitors designed to contain him should he try to resist. It was clear Ross had learned from past mistakes. They weren't taking any chances. Bruce stared at the flickering screen mounted on the far wall, displaying a live feed of the airport battle. He watched as Steve and his allies moved toward the Quinjet, preparing for their escape to Siberia. Tony stood in their way, armored and resolute, knowing that no words would stop what was coming. There was no turning back now. This fight was inevitable. Bruce exhaled slowly, pressing his head back against the cold metal wall. He had seen enough battles to know where this was heading. Then, the transport lurched violently to the side. Bruce barely had time to brace before another impact struck, metal screeching as the entire vehicle tilted, flipping onto its side. Sparks erupted from the control panels, alarms blaring in a chaotic chorus of sirens and static. Outside, through the narrow reinforced windows, he caught a glimpse of fire and smoke rising from the airstrip. The battle had just begun, and already the damage was spreading. Then, before he could process what was happening, there was an ear-splitting explosion. The armored doors to the transport ripped apart like paper. A shockwave of heat and pressure hit Bruce, sending him sprawling as metal debris rained down around him. His restraints sparked, circuits overloading from the blast, and the energy pulse flickered before dying out completely. For a moment, he was stunned, gasping for breath amidst the wreckage. Then, the tremors began, a familiar, unstoppable force rising within him. His heart pounded, the steady rhythm shifting into something faster, heavier, his vision blurred at the edges, green seeping into the corners of his mind. He clenched his fist, trying to fight it, trying to hold it back, but the rage had already taken root. His body tensed, muscles stretching, bones shifting under his skin. His breathing deepened, chest heaving as the familiar heat of transformation took hold. He squeezed his eyes shut, gritting his teeth, fighting the inevitable. Then his lips curled into a snarl. The world tore apart. With a monstrous roar, the Hulk burst from the wreckage, sending metal and debris flying in all directions. The ground shook beneath his weight as he took his first breath of freedom. His emerald skin glistened under the daylight, every muscle coiled with unrestrained power. His eyes, burning with fury, scanned the battlefield, but he saw no allies, only enemies. The war had just changed. For a moment, everyone froze. Steve Rogers, mid-sprint toward the Quinjet, skidded to a halt. Tony Stark, who had been preparing for another repulsor blast at Sam Wilson, turned sharply, his expression shifting from focus to sheer disbelief. Even T'Challa, usually unreadable behind his mask, hesitated. Then, Hulk moved, War Machine was the first target, still hovering in the air, his systems scanning the battlefield. Rhodey's voice came through the comms, firm but edged with caution. "Banner, stand down. You're not in control here." Hulk barely registered the words. With a single, thunderous leap, he shot into the sky, reaching War Machine in seconds. Before Rhodey could react, Hulk's massive hand wrapped around his leg and, in a single, devastating motion, slammed him into the concrete below. The impact sent shockwaves across the airstrip, cracks spiderwebbing through the asphalt. Rhodey groaned, his suit sparking violently as he struggled to move. "Holy shit," Spider-Man's voice cracked over the comms as he witnessed the destruction. Everything descended into chaos. Tony didn't hesitate, his armor whirred, shifting as the Hulkbuster 2.0 deployed. The reinforced plating locking into place with heavy metallic clicks. This suit was stronger than the last, faster, built specifically for the worst-case scenario. And this was the worst-case scenario. "Big guy." Tony's voice was steady, but beneath the modulated filter there was tension. "Let's not do this again." Hulk's gaze snapped toward him. His breathing was heavy, primal, nostrils flaring as he curled his fingers into fists. Puny Stark. Then he charged. Tony barely had time to brace before Hulk collided into him like a living missile. The sheer force sent the Hulkbuster sliding backward, feet digging trenches into the tarmac. Tony countered with a piston-powered punch, the force behind it enough to level a small building. The impact landed squarely on Hulk's jaw, but this time, he didn't go down. Hulk grabbed the Hulkbuster's arm and ripped it clean off. The metal tore like foil in his grasp, wires snapping, sparks flying as Tony stumbled back. Before he could react, Hulk grabbed him by the torso and hurled him into a parked aircraft. The jet crumpled on impact, fire bursting from its fuselage. The battle had now become one against all. Black Panther leapt onto Hulk's back, his vibranium claws slicing deep, but Hulk barely flinched. Falcon swooped in from above, unloading concussive rounds, but Hulk swatted him from the skies with a single backhanded blow. Spider-Man, moving fast, wrapped Hulk's arms in a web cocoon, trying to slow him down, but Hulk flexed, shattering the webs effortlessly. Mr. Stark, yeah, I don't think I can hold him." Steve Rogers moved next, his instincts taking over. He dodged a massive swing, rolling under Hulk's arm before launching his shield. It hit Hulk dead center on his forehead, but instead of staggering him, Hulk caught it midair. His fingers tightened, bending the vibranium ever so slightly before tossing it aside like a piece of scrap metal. But the moment everything changed was when Hulk saw the Quinjet. Bucky and Sam had almost reached it, preparing for their escape to Siberia. If they could take off, they could still stop Zemo before his plan could unfold. But Hulk didn't see a mission. Hulk saw movement. With a colossal leap, he reached the jet, his hand grabbing onto its wing and ripping it from the fuselage. The aircraft spun out of control, alarms blaring as it spiraled toward the ground in a fiery explosion. Steve Rogers stared in horror. Their plan was gone. Their only chance destroyed. And miles away in a frozen Hydra bunker, the super soldiers awakened. Zemo had won. The airport was in ruins. Smoke curled into the sky, thick and black, mixing with the sharp scent of burning fuel. The battlefield that had once been a clash of ideals, of brother against brother, had now become something far worse. This was no longer about the Sokovia Accords, no longer about control or freedom. This was about survival. Hulk was gone. The airstrike Tony had called in, an act of pure desperation, had been just enough to knock him unconscious for a brief moment. But when the smoke cleared, there was no sign of him. He had vanished into the chaos, retreating into the unknown, leaving behind nothing but devastation. Tony stood amidst the wreckage of his half-destroyed Hulkbuster suit. His breathing labored, his systems flashing critical alerts. His body ached from the beating he had taken, but the pain was nothing compared to the realization sinking into his gut. They had lost control of everything. Steve Rogers stood across the battlefield, bruised and bloodied, watching as the remains of the Quinjet burned. Their only way to Siberia was gone. Bucky, standing beside him, clenched his metal fist, his jaw tight. Sam looked down at the flames, silent. They all knew what this meant. They were too late. And at that very moment, thousands of miles away, in the heart of an abandoned Hydra bunker, the world's greatest nightmare was being unleashed. The facility was eerily silent, the air thick with frost, the hum of ancient machinery the only sound in the desolate Siberian wasteland. Inside the cryogenic chambers, 5 figures remained still, encased in ice, trapped in the limbo between life and death. For decades, they had been the ghosts of a forgotten war, hidden away by Hydra, waiting for a day that was never meant to come. And then, the systems activated. A low, mechanical hiss filled the air as the chambers began to thaw. The frost-covered glass cracked, the ice melting away in streams of water that pooled across the cold, steel floor. One by one, their eyes opened, cold, calculating, inhuman. These were not ordinary men. These were weapons, enhanced beyond human limits, their bodies engineered to withstand the harshest of battles, their minds broken and twisted into obedience. The first soldier stepped forward, his breath visible in the frigid air. His muscles tensed as he stretched, testing the strength that had once been his. Another followed, rolling his shoulders, cracking his knuckles. There was no confusion, no hesitation, only instinct. In the shadows, Zemo watched. He had prepared himself to kill them, to erase Hydra's legacy with his own hands. But now, the world had already done the job for him. The Avengers had fallen apart. The Sokovia Accords had turned them against each other, and now, Hulk's rampage had sealed their fate. The super soldiers were loose, and there was no one left to stop them. Zemo slowly lowered the gun he had planned to use. He didn't need to pull the trigger anymore. The war would come on its own. Back at the airport, T'Challa surveyed the wreckage. His eyes trailed over the unconscious bodies of Ross's forces, the crumpled remains of Tony's Hulkbuster armor, the shattered fragments of Steve's shield lying in the dirt. He had come here for revenge, for justice, but what he had found instead was something far more dangerous. The world had changed in a single afternoon. He approached Steve and Bucky, his steps slow but purposeful. Steve's expression was unreadable, but the pain in his eyes was unmistakable. He had fought so hard to prevent war, but in the end, it had come anyway. "You need to go," T'Challa said at last, his voice steady. Steve looked up at him. "Wakanda," T'Challa answered simply. "You have no place left in this world." Steve hesitated, exchanging a look with Bucky. He had never intended to involve Wakanda in this fight, but now, they had no choice. With the Accords in full effect, they were fugitives. With Hulk missing, there was no telling what kind of international response would come next. And with the super soldiers now free, the world was in greater danger than ever before. Finally, Steve nodded. "We'll leave now." T'Challa turned away, his mind already on what came next. Ross had overstepped. He had sent his forces into Wakanda once, and now, with the disaster that had unfolded here, he would be looking for someone to blame. It would not be long before Wakanda itself became a target. The King of Wakanda had never intended to fight in this war, but war had come for him nonetheless. Tony stood alone. He had watched Steve leave, watched the last remnants of his team scatter, watched the embers of the battle that should have never happened. But all he could think about was the Quinjet burning in the distance. Bucky had killed his parents. He had been ready to chase him to the ends of the earth for justice, but now that didn't even matter. Because somewhere out there, 5 more Winter Soldiers had just woken up, and Hulk was gone. Tony clenched his fists, his armor still dented from the fight, the weight of everything pressing down on him. Ross would demand answers. The UN would call for immediate action. And now, more than ever, the world would see the Avengers as dangerous, reckless, uncontrollable. We should have never let it come to this. The words left his mouth before he even realized it. He had thought he was doing the right thing, trying to prevent another disaster, trying to make sure no one got hurt the way he had been hurt. But now he wasn't sure he had made anything better. In the days that followed, the world watched in horror as footage of the battle leaked to the public. The sight of Hulk rampaging through the airport, tossing War Machine like a rag doll, tearing through Tony's Hulkbuster, leveling entire sections of the tarmac with every step. It was undeniable. Hulk was no longer just a problem for the Avengers. Hulk was a global threat. Ross seized the opportunity, branding Bruce Banner as the world's most dangerous fugitive. The Accords were no longer just about controlling heroes. They were about eliminating them. Nations around the world strengthened their defenses. Governments began developing anti-metahuman weapons. And the world edged ever closer to the kind of fear and paranoia that could never be undone. Meanwhile, in the shadows, the Hydra super soldiers began their campaign. They didn't attack all at once. They were smarter than that. They spread like a virus, infiltrating governments, sabotaging security forces, laying the groundwork for something far bigger. By the time the world realized what had happened, it would already be too late. And in the vast, uncharted wilds, far away from civilization, Hulk wandered alone. He had felt it, the fear in their eyes. The moment he had destroyed that jet, everything had changed. The Avengers would never take him back. The world would never trust him again. He had no home, no allies, only rage, only exile, only the inevitable return of a monster the world could no longer contain. And somewhere, deep in the cold void of space, Thanos sat upon his throne, watching. The Earth was tearing itself apart. The Avengers were broken. The last warriors who could have stood against him were too busy fighting each other. A thin smile crossed his lips. Soon, Thor had never known powerlessness quite like this. He had been humbled before, cast from Asgard, stripped of Mjolnir, brought to his knees by stronger foes. But this was different. This wasn't just defeat, it was humiliation. His wrists and ankles were bound, his once golden armor tattered and smeared with dirt. The heavy chain around his neck dug into his skin as his captors dragged him through the streets of Sakaar, a neon-lit wasteland of chaos and filth. The air was thick with the smell of oil and sweat, the city buzzing with the voices of gamblers, traders, and scavengers who lived off the misery of the unlucky. Thor barely had time to process where he was before he was thrown to his knees before a throne of excess. The Grandmaster sat atop a shimmering dais, draped in flowing golden robes, his fingers adorned with rings that caught the artificial glow of Sakaar's twin moons. He studied Thor with mild amusement, swirling a goblet of some strange neon liquid. "Ah, another one," he said, voice full of theatrical delight. "And look at you, blonde, muscular, rugged. I can already tell the audience will love you." Thor gritted his teeth, his muscles tensing against the restraints. "I am Thor, son of Odin. Yes,
And I'm sure you've got a whole list of titles, the Grand Master interrupted with a lazy wave of his hand. Look, I'll make this easy for you. You're my prisoner now. And you know what happens to prisoners on Sakaar? Thor already knew the answer before the Grand Master grinned. They fight. Thor's introduction to the arena was anything but honorable. He was dragged through dark corridors, the walls damp with the blood of fallen warriors. He could hear the roars of the crowd above, thousands of voices, chanting, screaming for the next spectacle. The guards pushed him forward, his hands still bound, and threw him into a preparation chamber. Across from him, standing with an air of confidence and detachment, was Loki. Thor's heart clenched at the sight of his brother, not because he hadn't expected to see him, but because of the way Loki looked at him. There was no concern, no urgency, not even a flicker of guilt, just amusement. Well, Loki drawled, adjusting his emerald-lined cape. Look what the garbage dump dragged in. Thor pushed himself to his feet, breathing heavily. Loki. Thor. Loki's smirk deepened. I heard you had a bit of a fall. Thor's jaw tightened. You knew I was here. Of course I knew, Loki said smoothly. I've been here for weeks. And while you were getting yourself beaten and dragged around like an animal, I've been making myself rather comfortable. Thor's fists clenched, even as the chains hummed against his skin. You're working for him. Survival, dear brother, Loki replied, tilting his head. You should try it sometime. The doors groaned open, flooding the chamber with blinding white light. The distant roar of the crowd became deafening. A guard stepped forward, pressing a device to Thor's neck. The moment it touched him, electricity seared through his spine, sending him to his knees. No sudden moves, the guard warned. Thor gasped, his body convulsing as the pain receded. His vision was still blurred when he heard the Grand Master's voice echo through the arena. Ladies and gentlemen, beings of all kinds, it's time for your next event. The guards dragged Thor forward. Our reigning champion needs a warm-up, the Grand Master continued. So tonight he faces a very special opponent. Thor was shoved onto the battlefield. The arena was massive, a coliseum of stone and metal, surrounded by a thunderous, bloodthirsty audience. The sky above was a swirling vortex of wormholes, tearing open and collapsing in on themselves, like endless wounds in the cosmos. The god of thunder himself, Thor of Asgard. The crowd erupted in cheers, though whether they were cheering for him or the prospect of his defeat, he couldn't tell. Then, the Grandmaster spoke again, voice thick with amusement. And facing him, our beloved champion. A second door slid open across the arena. Thor squinted against the harsh lights, expecting some monstrous warrior to step through. Instead, Loki walked onto the battlefield. The world went silent. Thor's heart slammed against his ribs, his breath hitched. He searched Loki's face for any sign of hesitation, any flicker of remorse, but there was nothing. Loki smiled as he drew two curved daggers from his belt. Don't look so surprised, brother, he said softly. Only one of us is leaving this arena alive. The moment the gong rang, Loki struck. Thor barely dodged the first dagger, twisting away as the blade sliced through the air near his throat. Loki moved fast, ruthless, slashing in rapid succession. The crowd roared as Thor ducked, rolled, barely keeping up. You don't have to do this, Thor shouted, blocking another strike. Loki's eyes flashed. Yes, I do. Thor grabbed his brother's wrist, twisting it hard. But Loki countered immediately, sweeping his legs out from under him. Thor crashed to the sand. The wind knocked from his lungs. Loki didn't hesitate. He lunged, dagger poised for the kill. Thor barely caught his arm in time. They struggled, Loki pressing down, blade inches from Thor's throat. Fight back, Loki hissed. Not against you, Thor growled through clenched teeth. Loki snarled and slammed his knee into Thor's ribs. The impact sent Thor rolling across the arena floor. He coughed, spitting out blood. Loki was actually trying to kill him. Before Loki could strike again, a new voice thundered across the arena. Enough! A massive, armored figure leapt from the stands, landing between them with an earth-shaking impact. Beta Ray Bill. The crowd gasped, the Grandmaster cursed, and Thor struggled to catch his breath. Bill's golden eyes burned with fury as he stood between the brothers, gripping his massive warhammer. This fight is a farce, Bill growled, turning to the Grandmaster's throne. I will not kill for your amusement. The Grandmaster's face twisted in displeasure. Now, Bill, let's not be rash. But Thor wasn't listening anymore. He stared up at Beta Ray Bill, recognition flashing through his mind. This was no ordinary warrior. This was someone worthy of a king's respect. And for the first time since arriving on Sakaar, Thor saw a way out. The arena was in chaos. Beta Ray Bill's defiance had shattered the illusion of control, and the Grandmaster's forces surged onto the battlefield. Guards armed with energy staffs poured in from all sides, weapons crackling as they tried to subdue the rebellion before it could begin. But they had made one mistake. They had just given Thor his opening. With a surge of energy, Thor rolled to his feet, dodging a soldier's electrified baton. His eyes flashed with stormlight, his body already moving on instinct. He caught the next attacker's wrist, twisted it sharply, and drove his elbow into the soldier's ribs. The guard collapsed, and Thor immediately grabbed his weapon, turning it against the others. Beta Ray Bill fought like a living storm, hammer crashing into the ground with bone-breaking force. Every swing sent bodies flying, his movements precise, honed from years in the arena. Valkyrie, finally free of her own restraints, danced between enemies like a ghost, cutting through their ranks with fluid efficiency. And Loki was trying to escape. Thor caught a glimpse of him slipping toward the exit, his green cape billowing as he weaved through the chaos. Of course, Thor should have known. Loki had no loyalty but to himself. His betrayal had been complete. For a fleeting second, Thor felt an ache in his chest. Even now, some part of him had still hoped. But he pushed the thought away. He had more important things to worry about. Valkyrie Bill, he called over the battle. We need a ship. Valkyrie nodded sharply, cutting down the last of her attackers. I know where to find one. Then move. As they fought their way through the collapsing arena, Thor cast one last look back at Loki. For the first time, he didn't try to stop him. Loki had made his choice. Thor wouldn't make it for him. Asgard was dying. The Bifrost, once a beacon of golden light, was now a shattered ruin, its bridge cracked and crumbling under the weight of Hela's conquest. The towering spires of the city were dark, flames licking at their edges, blackened by the touch of death itself. And at the heart of it all stood Hela. She watched from the throne, draped in shadows, the ruined kingdom stretching before her like a prize she had waited eons to claim. Her expression was unreadable, part satisfaction, part hunger. Her undead army stood in perfect silence, awaiting her command. Fenris, the massive wolf, prowled the outskirts of the palace, its yellow eyes glowing in the darkness. Hela could feel it the moment Thor returned. Her lips curled into a smile. Come home, little brother, she murmured. Let's finish this. Lightning split the sky as Thor descended onto the burning city, Beta Ray Bill and Valkyrie at his side. They landed in the ruins of the palace square, their boots crunching against shattered stone. The air was thick with the scent of ash. Thor took in the devastation, his jaw tightening. This isn't Asgard anymore. A slow, deliberate clap echoed through the emptiness. Hela stepped forward from the throne, her black armor gleaming under the scorched sky. Her emerald eyes locked onto Thor, filled with cold amusement. "I was wondering when you'd come crawling back," she said smoothly. Thor exhaled, steadying himself. This time, he didn't have Mjolnir. He didn't have Hulk. He had only himself, and that would have to be enough. "Hela," he said evenly, "your reign ends today." She tilted her head, mock curiosity in her expression. "Oh, and what army do you have left, little brother?" Thor's grip tightened on his axe. "We don't need an army." Hela's smile vanished. With a flick of her wrist, jagged black blades erupted from the ground, spearing toward them. Thor lunged forward, dodging the first wave, electricity crackling across his skin. Valkyrie and Beta Ray Bill charged into battle, splitting off to face the approaching undead. And then, the real fight began. The massive wolf lunged, its fangs bared, claws gouging trenches into the palace steps. Beta Ray Bill met the charge head-on, his warhammer crackling with cosmic energy. They collided like titans. The impact sent shockwaves rippling through the battlefield. Bill swung his hammer in a brutal arc, slamming it into Fenris's side. The wolf yelped, its ribs fracturing under the sheer force of the blow, but it recovered quickly, snapping its jaws at Bill's throat. Bill barely dodged, rolling under the beast's massive paws. He swung upward, his hammer connecting with Fenris's jaw, shattering teeth. Fenris retaliated with a swipe of its claws, raking across Bill's chest. Blood splattered against the stone. Bill stumbled but didn't fall. He tightened his grip on his hammer, pushing forward. He would hold the line. Asgard's people needed time. Thor needed time. Thor dove toward Hela, lightning surging through his veins. He struck fast, relentless, brutal. But Hela was faster. She dodged his first swing, countering with a blade aimed at his ribs. Thor barely twisted away in time. The second blade sliced across his shoulder, sending fire through his nerves. He gritted his teeth. Hela smirked. "You should have stayed in exile." Thor's eyes burned with electricity. "I should have done a lot of things." He struck again, this time hitting her with the full force of a storm. Lightning tore through the battlefield, blasting Hela backward. She hit the stone hard, but instead of retreating, she laughed. "That's more like it." She surged forward, slashing again and again. Thor dodged as best he could, but she was too fast, too strong. He could feel himself weakening, his wounds deepening, and then... "Thor!" Beta Ray Bill's shout rang through the chaos. Thor turned just in time to see Fenris collapsing, Beta Ray Bill standing over it, bloodied but victorious. Bill staggered, clutching his side. He wouldn't last much longer. "We have to move the people now," Valkyrie shouted from the Bifrost, ushering the last of Asgard's citizens onto the evacuation ship. Thor gritted his teeth. There was only one option left. "Loki, get the eternal flame," Thor shouted. Loki hesitated. Thor's eyes met his brother's. And finally, Loki made his choice. Surtur rose from the depths, fire consuming everything in his wake. Hela's eyes widened in shock. "No," she whispered. But it was too late. Thor and Beta Ray Bill retreated to the ship, helping Valkyrie pull the last civilians aboard. The Bifrost shattered beneath Surtur's massive form. Hela screamed in fury, lunging at the fire giant, and then, with one final swing of his sword, Asgard was no more. Asgard was gone. The echoes of its destruction still thundered across the void. Surtur's flames consuming what had once been the golden realm of the gods. The last survivors, the remnants of a once great people, drifted silently through the darkness aboard their stolen ship, carrying with them nothing but the weight of exile. Thor stood at the ship's bridge, staring out into the endless abyss, watching the final embers of Asgard flicker and die. His hands clenched at his sides, his muscles aching from battle, his body riddled with wounds that would never fully heal. His home, his people, all of it had been stolen from him. But Asgard was not a place, Asgard was a people. He had to believe that. The door behind him slid open with a soft hiss. Thor didn't turn. He already knew who it was. Loki. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was heavier than it had ever been. Loki stepped forward, standing beside his brother, gazing into the void as well. "You finally made the right choice," Thor murmured, his voice quiet. Loki exhaled, shaking his head. Maybe. Or maybe it was just the only choice left. Thor studied his brother's face. The arrogance, the cunning. It was still there, but there was something else now, something different. Regret. Thor nodded once. That was enough. But before either of them could say anything more, the ship's alarms began to blare. A shadow fell over them, swallowing the light of distant stars. And in that moment, Thor realized the battle wasn't over. The ship was massive, a hulking, ominous dreadnought that dwarfed their own vessel, looming like a predator over dying prey. Its hull was sleek and black, adorned with golden accents that gleamed under the void's dim glow. It was a warship unlike any Thor had ever seen. And at its heart was Thanos. Thor's breath caught in his throat. He had never felt a presence like this before. This wasn't just another conqueror, another tyrant seeking power. This was something worse. This was inevitable. Beta Ray Bill appeared at Thor's side, his wounds still fresh, his hammer gripped tightly in his hand. His golden eyes flickered with recognition. "This is him," Bill said grimly. "Who?" Thor asked. Beta Ray Bill clenched his jaw. "The one who destroys everything." Then, the first explosion hit. The ship shook violently, energy blasts tearing through its hull. The Asgardian survivors screamed as the lights flickered, the metal beneath them groaning as the structure buckled. "Get to the escape pods," Thor roared, sprinting toward the control panel. He slammed his fist against the emergency override, activating the evacuation protocol. Now! Asgardians began rushing toward the lower decks, their voices drowned out by the thunderous impact of another blast. The air grew thick with smoke and fire. Then, with a crackling boom, a dark figure materialized on the bridge. Thanos. The Mad Titan stood before them, towering, his golden armor gleaming under the flickering emergency lights. His presence alone suffocated the air in the room. The Power Stone pulsed in his gauntlet, radiating a terrible energy that made the very ship tremble beneath them. Thor lunged first. He swung his hammer with everything he had, lightning crackling along its edge. Thanos caught it midair. With a single, devastating backhand, he sent Thor crashing through the control panel, sparks exploding around him. Thor gasped as pain shot through his ribs. He tried to rise, but Thanos was already moving. Beta Ray Bill charged. He roared like a storm, swinging his warhammer in a perfect arc. The blow connected, slamming into Thanos' ribs with a sickening crunch. The Mad Titan staggered. Thor's eyes widened. Bill had heard him. Thanos grunted, exhaling slowly, then turned his gaze on Beta Ray Bill. And then he smiled. Impressive, Thanos mused, rolling his shoulder. He clenched his gauntlet. The Power Stone flared to life. And in an instant, Bill was gone. A shockwave of purple energy erupted from the Titan's fist, slamming into Beta Ray Bill like a falling star. The Corbinite warrior flew backward, smashing through the reinforced walls of the bridge. He hit the deck hard, metal shattering beneath him. But he got back up, barely. Bill coughed, blood dripping from his mouth. His body trembled from the sheer force of the blow, but he still held his hammer. He still stood. He wasn't done. "Thor," Bill rasped, barely able to breathe. "Get them out of here." Thor's stomach dropped. He knew that look. Bill wasn't planning to survive this. "No," Thor growled, forcing himself to stand. "We fight together." Bill shoved him back. "Go," Bill roared, turning back to Thanos. His grip on his hammer tightened. "I'll buy you time." Thor froze. Everything in him screamed to stay, to fight, to stand by Bill's side and die a warrior's death. But then he saw Loki, standing by the escape pods holding the Tesseract. He saw the terrified faces of his people, waiting for him to lead. He had to go. Thor clenched his fists. His lightning flickered, then faded. He took a step back, then another. Beta Ray Bill turned back to Thanos, his breathing slow and steady. This was his final stand. Thor and Loki stepped into the escape pod. The doors closed, and the last thing Thor saw was Beta Ray Bill standing against impossible odds, hammer raised unyielding. The doors sealed shut. The escape pod launched into space. Thor pressed his hands against the window, watching in horrified silence as Thanos advanced toward Beta Ray Bill. Bill lunged one last time. His hammer glowed with the light of dying stars. He swung with everything he had, and Thanos caught it. The Mad Titan drove his fist into Bill's chest. The blow cracked bone, ruptured organs. Beta Ray Bill's body lurched violently, but he did not scream. He did not falter. He simply stared into Thanos' eyes and he smiled. "You should have killed me first." With one last defiant roar, Beta Ray Bill channeled all his remaining strength and struck Thanos in the face. Lightning exploded outward. For the first time in centuries, Thanos bled. And then, with a sickening crack, Thanos wrapped his gauntleted hand around Beta Ray Bill's throat and snapped his neck. The pod hurtled toward Earth, breaking through the atmosphere in a burning streak of fire. Thor sat in silence, staring at the floor, his breath shallow, his hands trembling. Beta Ray Bill was gone, his friend, his brother in arms, dead. Loki sat beside him, the Tesseract resting in his lap. For once, he said nothing. They had both lost everything, but they still had one thing left. "We need to find Stark," Thor said at last, his voice hollow. "We need to bring the Avengers back together." The pod crashed into the Sanctum Sanctorum, and the war for Earth began. The sky over New York burned. A meteor, wreathed in fire, streaked across the night, a blazing wound against the stars. It fell fast, plummeting through the clouds, roaring toward the city below. But this was no ordinary meteor. It was a ship. Inside, Thor and Loki braced themselves as the escape pod screamed through the atmosphere, the metal plating glowing red hot from the friction. The impact alarms blared, warning of imminent collision, but neither god paid them any mind. Thor wasn't thinking about the landing. He was thinking about what they had just lost. Beta Ray Bill was dead. The Mad Titan had snapped his neck, discarding him like nothing more than a minor inconvenience. Even now, the image burned into Thor's mind. Bill's defiant last stand. The way he had smiled even as he fell. Thor gritted his teeth. His fingers tightened around Stormbreaker's handle. "I should have stayed," he muttered. Loki glanced at him from the co-pilot's seat, his expression unreadable. He had no witty remark, no sharp retort. For once, he was just as shaken as Thor. "Then we'd both be dead," Loki said quietly. Bill made his choice. Thor exhaled sharply but said nothing. He turned his gaze forward, just as the pod broke through the last of the clouds. The Sanctum Sanctorum loomed below. Brace yourself, Loki muttered. And then, impact. The pod slammed into the streets of New York, skidding violently across the pavement, metal screeching against stone. Debris exploded outward, cars flipping from the sheer force of the crash. The dust hadn't even settled before the ship's hatch burst open. Thor stumbled out first, Stormbreaker in hand, breathing heavily. Loki followed, a little more composed, brushing dust off his black and green robes. A moment later, the front doors of the sanctum swung open. Doctor Strange and Wong stepped forward, their expressions tense. "I hope you have a good reason for dropping a burning wreck in the middle of my city," Strange said coolly. Thor locked eyes with him. "We do." He stepped aside, revealing what Loki carried in his hands, the Tesseract. It pulsed with power, its blue glow illuminating Loki's face. Strange's gaze darkened. This just became a problem. Minutes later, inside the sanctum, the air was thick with tension. The Tesseract rested in the center of a protective sigil Strange had hastily drawn on the floor, its glow flickering against the candlelit chamber. Thor, Loki, and Strange stood in a tight circle, but all eyes were on the man who had just arrived, Tony Stark. He studied the Tesseract for a long moment, arms crossed over his chest, his expression unreadable. Then, finally, he exhaled. "You have got to be kidding me," Tony muttered. "So not only do we have a homicidal space warlord coming to wipe us out, but you two decided to bring him a gift?" Loki's eyes flickered with irritation. "Would you rather we left it floating in space for him to pick up?" "Honestly, yeah, that would have been great," Tony shot back. "Then maybe he'd waste a little more time looking for it." Thor's patience was running thin. "Enough. We don't have time for this. Thanos is coming. He already has the power and reality stones. If we don't prepare now, this world will be next." Strange nodded in agreement. Thor's right. The Tesseract's presence here will draw Thanos to Earth much faster than before. "Great," Tony muttered, rubbing his temples. "So we're on the clock." Strange folded his arms. "We have two choices. We either destroy the Tesseract now, preventing Thanos from ever getting it, or we move it somewhere he won't find it," Loki finished. Thor shot his brother a look. "And where do you suggest? The bottom of the ocean?" "Actually, I was thinking of Wakanda," Loki said smoothly. Strange's eyebrows lifted. "Not a bad idea. Their defenses are some of the strongest on the planet," Tony sighed, glancing at Thor. "So, let me guess. You want to put out a call, bring back the band?" Thor nodded. "We need to reunite the Avengers. We don't have a choice." For a long moment, Tony hesitated. Then, finally, he pulled out his phone. "All right," he sighed. "Let's call Steve." Deep in an abandoned safe house, Steve Rogers read the message on his burner phone. "Need you in New York. Big problem. Call me." He turned to Natasha and Sam, who were sitting across from him waiting. "Tony?" Natasha asked. Steve nodded. Sam exhaled. "Guess it was only a matter of time." Steve pocketed the phone. "We leave in an hour." Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, Bruce Banner sat alone in a remote cabin, staring at his reflection in the window. He had spent years running, years burying Hulk deep inside, fearing what would happen if he ever lost control again. Then his burner phone buzzed. The message was short, simple. "Need you back. Thanos is coming." Bruce stared at it for a long moment. Then, slowly, he stood. It was time to stop hiding. Hours later, the Avengers stood in the Wakandan throne room. Thor, Loki, Steve, Tony, Natasha, Sam, Bruce, and T'Challa all gathered around the holographic map of Earth, planning their next move. T'Challa studied them all carefully. You wish to bring the Tesseract here? Thor nodded. If there is any place strong enough to protect it, it's Wakanda. T'Challa considered it. Then, finally, he nodded. Then we will stand together. Tony sighed, running a hand down his face. This is really happening, huh? Yes, Steve said. His voice was steady. Thanos is coming. And for the first time since the fall of the Avengers, they all stood together once more. On the edges of deep space, Thanos sat in the darkness of his throne. The reality stone burned in his gauntlet, pulsing with raw, infinite power. The Black Order stood before him, their eyes lowered in deference. We have found the Tesseract, Corvus Glaive murmured. It is on Earth. Thanos smiled. Slowly, he rose to his feet, his massive frame casting a long shadow across the chamber. Then let us go to war. The skies above Wakanda were unnervingly still, and the usual warmth of the golden sun felt cold, distant, as if the universe itself had paused to watch what was about to unfold. From the throne room balcony, Thor gazed out at the vast plains stretching beyond the protective golden dome of Wakanda's shields. The horizon was quiet, for now, but he could feel it. Something was coming. His grip tightened around Stormbreaker, his knuckles turning white. His heart pounded, heavy with the weight of everything leading to this moment. He had fought countless wars, lost countless battles, but this was different. This wasn't just about Asgard. This wasn't just about vengeance. This was about everything. A few steps behind him, Steve Rogers watched in silence, arms folded across his chest. His uniform, old and battle-worn, bore no star anymore. Just the fading memory of a shield that once symbolized unity. He had seen war before, but this was unlike anything he had ever prepared for. Thor exhaled, finally breaking the silence. How long do you think we have? Steve shook his head. Not long enough. As if on cue, a piercing siren wailed across the city. Shuri's voice crackled through the intercom system, her usually composed tone carrying a rare urgency. Energy readings spiking, something is entering the atmosphere. Thor's eyes snapped upward, and there, streaking through the sky, was a dark, fiery object falling toward them. No, it wasn't just one, it was hundreds. The invasion had begun. Within seconds, the Wakandan shields shimmered with impact, the first wave of Thanos' forces crashing against them like a hurricane. Out in the battlefield, the protective dome of the city stretched like an impenetrable wall, a final barrier between Earth's last hope and oblivion. But on the other side, just beyond the shimmering golden light, the landscape had transformed into something unnatural. The armies of Thanos stood in eerie silence, thousands of creatures, grotesque and unnatural, writhing with hunger. The Outriders, the twisted foot soldiers of the Black Order, clawed at the ground, their misshapen bodies quivering in anticipation. At the center of the army, standing tall and unmoving, were the Black Order. Ebony Maw's sharp, elongated finger hovered in the air, a dark energy swirling around them. Proxima Midnight stood beside him, her deadly spear resting on her shoulder, her eyes fixed on the shield with predatory intent. Corvus Glaive remained still, his blade resting lightly at his side, but there was no mistaking the tension in his posture. They were waiting. Then the shield wavered, and then the war began. The moment the first Outrider broke through the shield, Wakanda erupted into chaos. The ground trembled under the weight of the creatures, a stampede of gnashing teeth and clawed limbs surging toward the city. The Wakandan forces met them first, their battle cries piercing the air as they clashed against the horde. Vibranium weapons cut through flesh, energy blasts lit up the battlefield, but the creatures kept coming. And then, The Avengers joined the fight. Thor was the first into the fray. He soared from the palace balcony, Stormbreaker humming with energy, and when he hit the ground, the impact sent shockwaves through the battlefield. He swung his axe in a wide arc, lightning erupting outward, tearing through Outriders as if they were nothing. Beside him, Steve Rogers moved like a ghost through the chaos. He had no shield, no super armor, just his raw skill and strength. Every punch, every strike was calculated, precise. He used Wakandan gauntlets now, their vibranium plating humming with power as he fought. Further back, Black Panther leapt into the battle, his suit absorbing the kinetic force of each blow, only to release it in devastating bursts. He moved like a shadow, his claws ripping through enemy ranks as Dora Milaje warriors fought at his side. And then, Hulk roared. For the first time since Civil War, Bruce Banner had finally let go. The transformation had been immediate, violent. The rage he had buried for years unleashed all at once. Hulk tore through the enemy ranks like a force of nature, his fists shattering Outriders, his sheer presence sending a ripple of fear through Thanos' forces. He had been beaten before, humiliated, but not today. Today the Hulk was unstoppable. From above, Falcon rained down precise shots, weaving between enemy ships like a blur of red and silver. To his side, War Machine unleashed hell, his shoulder cannons launching explosives into the horde. Loki fought among them too, his daggers flashing like silver lightning, illusions creating dozens of false versions of himself, confusing and disorienting the enemy. He was not the same Loki who had led an invasion years ago. This time he fought to protect. For the first time in his life, he fought for something bigger than himself. But even with all their might, the battle was turning. Because Thanos had arrived. A dark portal opened on the battlefield, and through it the Mad Titan stepped. Even from a distance, his presence was suffocating. He moved with absolute certainty, absolute control. Hulk saw him first, and he charged. With a deafening roar, Hulk leapt, swinging a massive fist toward Thanos' skull. This time he would not lose. Thanos barely moved. With a single, effortless motion, he caught Hulk's punch. Then he twisted Hulk's wrist, shattering the bones instantly. Hulk's roar of pain shook the battlefield. Before he could recover, Thanos drove a brutal knee into his ribs, sending the green behemoth crashing into the dirt, motionless. The battlefield went still. Thor's breath caught in his throat. He had fought countless gods, but Thanos was something else. This wasn't a warlord. This wasn't just another tyrant seeking conquest. This was death itself. Thanos turned his gaze toward them, toward Loki. The Tesseract pulsed in Loki's hands. He looked down at it, then up at Thanos, his fingers curled around the cube. And for the first time in his life, Loki hesitated. Thor saw it happen in slow motion. The flicker of doubt in Loki's eyes. The second of hesitation. The way his jaw clenched, his mind racing. And then, Loki made his choice. With one swift movement, he tossed the Tesseract to Thor. "Run!" Loki bellowed. The battlefield erupted into chaos. Thanos lunged forward, his hand reaching for the cube. But Thor had already moved. Stormbreaker crackled with lightning, and the god of thunder attacked. Thanos staggered backward, his massive frame weakened for the first time since he'd begun his conquest. Thor pressed his advantage, and Stormbreaker glowing fiercely in his grip, lightning pouring from his eyes like a storm unleashed. The axe came down again and again, each strike tearing at Thanos' defenses, shattering his once impenetrable armor. The Mad Titan, sensing defeat, desperately tried to harness the Power Stone once more. But Thor was relentless, his rage unstoppable. Then Loki stepped forward, his illusions flooding the battlefield. Countless versions of himself appeared circling Thanos, each one indistinguishable from the others. The Titan roared in frustration, swinging blindly, his movements wild and uncontrolled. With a sudden burst of magic, Loki appeared behind Thanos, plunging one of his daggers deep into Thanos' side. The Titan screamed, spinning violently, and backhanded Loki with devastating force. Loki was hurled through the air, crashing onto the battlefield, broken but alive. Witnessing Loki's fall, Hulk's roar of fury shook the earth. Charging like an unstoppable avalanche, Hulk smashed into Thanos, sending them both crashing to the ground. His fist came down mercilessly, blow after blow filled with years of rage and regret. Thanos fought back, desperate and weakened, but Hulk was relentless. Finally, with a primal scream of fury, Hulk slammed his fist into Thanos' chest, cracking ribs and sending the Titan sprawling. Doctor Strange saw his moment. Eyes blazing with intensity, he opened a portal just around Thanos' arm, right at the gauntlet. In a flash of motion, he closed the portal, severing Thanos' arm cleanly from his body. The Infinity Gauntlet, now separated from its master, tumbled free, landing with a heavy thud. Captain America saw it instantly. With no hesitation, he lunged forward, slipping his hand into the gauntlet. Raw, cosmic energy surged through his body, nearly overwhelming him. Steve grit his teeth, his entire body trembling violently from the force of the Infinity Stones. He raised his gaze, looking at the friends he had fought beside for years, taking them all in one final time. "Steve, no!" Tony shouted, panic rising in his voice. Steve met his eyes, calm and resolved. Whatever it takes. And then, without another thought, Captain America snapped his fingers. A pulse of energy rippled outward, enveloping the battlefield, washing over allies and enemies alike. The Outriders and Thanos' warships began dissolving instantly, their bodies turning to ash and dust, scattering into the winds of Wakanda. The battle was over. Slowly, the Avengers turned, seeing Steve collapse onto the scorched battlefield, breathing shallowly, his body broken beyond repair. Tony and Thor sprinted to his side, kneeling next to their fallen friend. Did we win?" Steve whispered, his voice faint and fading. Tony choked back tears, grasping Steve's hand tightly. "You saved us, Cap. You did it." A faint smile flickered across Steve's face. His gaze shifted to Thor. "Take care of them. Protect Earth." Thor nodded solemnly. "Always, my friend." Steve drew in one last breath, calm and content. Then it was worth it, every second. With those final words, Captain America Steve Rogers closed his eyes forever, peaceful in victory. The aftermath was solemn, a profound silence settling over Wakanda. Days later, the Avengers stood together one last time, honoring their fallen leader. Steve's shield, battered and scarred from battle, lay atop his casket draped in the American flag. Tony stood at the forefront, his voice shaking but strong. Steve Rogers wasn't just Captain America. He was the best of us. He showed us what it meant to fight, to sacrifice, to never give in, even when hope seemed lost. He gave us a chance, a second chance, and we will never forget him. The funeral concluded with solemn respect. Steve Rogers laid to rest beneath the peaceful sunlight of Wakanda. Thor and Loki, standing side by side, gazed out over the peaceful city, determined to protect this fragile world from ever knowing such pain again. Hulk stood quietly near Steve's grave, Banner's mind calm within him for the first time in years. He was at peace, unified with his other self, ready to embrace a new role as protector rather than monster. Earth had survived. The Avengers had won, But victory carried a heavy price, one they would never forget. For now, the Avengers would heal, rebuild, and honor the legacy Steve Rogers had left behind. A world finally safe, but never again the same. And somewhere in the vastness of space, worlds would whisper of Earth, the small, stubborn planet that faced oblivion and survived, protected forevermore by heroes who stood together against impossible odds and emerged victorious.
And that is going to be it, my fellow watchers of the multiverse. What did you think of this fan fiction video? And if you guys are new to the Missed the Part channel, my name is Max Charlebois, and I just can't thank you guys enough for the support. I would highly recommend that you guys check out the YouTube community page and possibly becoming a member on there, as becoming a member really goes a long way for the support. And I would highly recommend that you guys check out the Patreon as well, as even the Patreon has so many different perks, and I would highly recommend it if you guys want to see a lot of the behind the scenes content. But again, thank you guys so very much for watching. Let me know what you think, and I will see you in the next video. Take care and have a wonderful day. Peace out.